So it looks like summer vacation is slowly interrupting less and less with our Sunday activities. Good to see everybody. And welcome, Jared.
Thank you.
Glad to have you.
Thank you.
You're now a senior resident, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the language is.
Yeah.
Let's just go with that.
Believe me, at some point you have to accept that term senior.
Yeah.
I still can't say middle age and I'm about to turn 50. So,
Yeah.
Premature.
Yeah. Well, okay. What else going on in church? We have this week on Wednesday, although it's not until next week that we resume our Wednesday evening activities. This Wednesday we do have a couple of events coming up. One is in order to get our junior residents on board, we're having a brief church conference in the community hall at the noon lunch to license Leanna Coyle Carr and Lee Curl, our new residents. And also, we have a report of I love this, the committee to nominate the committee on committees. I got to serve on that. So that's like the pinnacle of Baptist bureaucracy. Right there. Basically to report on who's going to serve on the committee on committees. Who decides who's on the committee? So anyway, there you go. There you have it. Also, Wednesday evening, we are having, either we're having or we're hosting, or both, I guess, a civil dialogue group. It meets periodically to attempt to model paths towards civil dialogue on difficult issues. The issue currently that they will be discussing or having dialogue about is the recent mass shootings and a possible way forward on that issue. So that's at 6 p.m., 3301.
It's right there.
Right, okay, the Epiphany room, okay. So that's 6 p.m. right over there in the Epiphany room for anyone who wants to go. Then, we have on Saturday a church-wide baby shower. We still are collecting money for that? I need to.
Yes, we just, I think Diana was saying we just hit $200, and that's really good. And if anybody hasn't signed the card, I don't even know where the card is. Oh, if anybody hasn't signed the card, please see Diana and sign the card.
Okay. Also, we need to, although this is further down the road, but please don't forget, September 14th is the banquet at Temple Emmanuel, honor George's 30th anniversary with us. It's a ticketed event. We need to get tickets. Yeah. We are going to sit together as a class. I don't know how many people we have. The three of us.
And there's a list going around for that right now.
Oh, okay. Here we go. Oh, we're almost up to 2 tables. Did you put? Okay. Yeah. So make sure to give money for this, and then we will get. It looks like we're going to get 2.
We'll like 2 tables. I'll buy the second table this afternoon.
Okay. All right, so there's that. And then finally, I know I'm forgetting something. Maybe I'm not. So next Sunday is Promotion Sunday. So the kids get moved up one level to Sunday school class. It's also an opportunity for adults to, if you want to change it up a little bit or get to go to a new class, it's sort of the time to do that. Just to let you know, I will be one of those people that will be promoting myself. I'm just going down the hall, which I already have been doing, to Perennial. They've got the same kind of philosophy and approach to class that we do. They just have fewer people. So I think it's good to help. I mean, they've got traction. But I think it will help to get a little bit more traction there. So,
and Henry, we appreciate what you've done. There's a card there for you that the class is signed.
Oh, thank you.
You don't have to sign it.
But you do have to read it.
Well, thank you very much. much.
That's funny.
Thank you so much. But
And
anyway,
we'll
yes,
take you back
I
anytime.
really,
No
they
kidding.
don't get started until later, so I'm gonna come hang out here.
There you go.
Oh,
There you
good.
Just leave your name tag.
Okay. And I still want to teach. I haven't much this year because of.
Yes, we'll ask you to come teach.
But I still want to do that, so I am going to still consider myself being
You've got a lot
member
to
of
do.
both classes, so.
Good.
But anyway, so, anyway, if you know other people that might want to promote themselves into here, feel free to kind of spread the word about Promotion Sunday. Any other announcements? Anything that I've left out? Well, okay. Did we run out of time on Blake Perry?
Today's the last day.
Today is the last day for collecting supplies for refugee children as part of Blake Perry's Eagle Scout project. So if you haven't done that, you can coordinate with him or still drop them off in the little bins that you see around church.
And we do have 2 birthdays in the class.
And we do.
Neither one are here. Michael Cox and Carolyn Strickland. Carolyn will be back and will be sitting with us at George's at 30th. So she's already sent her money to us, and so we're ready.
Oh, good, all right. I haven't seen Michael in a while. Okay. So when we see Michael, tell him happy birthday. Okay. Well, Jared, glad to have you.
Thank you.
What are we doing? Apostolic authority?
What are we doing?
That's right.
All right.
That's right. That's what we're doing.
Well, I'll let you get to it. Glad to have you again and welcome.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here with you again. Interesting note. I don't know if some people may have heard this already, but Blake Perry's Eagle Scout project, he's had people that he doesn't even know from around the U.S. send him donations. They found a post about his project or something on Facebook. They wanted to do something for folks at the border and had no idea what to do or how to do it, and thought, well, here's this young man at least taking donations, and so they mailed him some donations to take down there. Pretty neat how these things have a reach beyond what we expect sometimes.
It's a really huge act of faith, too.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
One
Yeah.
of the good uses of social media, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Because there are people that want to do something,
And
but they
he's
don't
had a
know.
wondrous response,
Believe it or not.
wonderful response.
Really, has he?
Oh,
Yeah, I know James told me that they've had multiple bags full almost daily, so I don't know any sort of total count, do you? But yeah, it's going well. Pretty neat project, so. Well, thanks for having me with you again. It seems like it's been a long time, so I'm glad to be here with you again. Today we're covering, well, you see it on the board, but the last few chapters of the book of 2 Corinthians. Interestingly, the scholars tend to agree that what we're covering here is actually a book in itself, if you will. That this section of chapters is probably should be called 4th Corinthians. So 1 Corinthians is 1 Corinthians. There is reference in 2 Corinthians to a painful letter that Paul wrote that is generally thought to be the second letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. And then scholars tend to think that 2 Corinthians is actually 2 letters that have been put together. The first 9 chapters, maybe we would call 3 Corinthians, and then these last few chapters, 10 to 13, 4th Corinthians. So we're going to look at these chapters kind of understanding that Paul and the people in Corinth have a history. He has visited them multiple times. At one point, he stayed there for a longer length of time. And he's written these different letters that sort of chart a sort of tumultuous relationship with the Corinthians. He makes reference to this painful letter and to something that happened in Corinth with a person who is to blame, but he doesn't really give any indication what that was. But we sort of read in these letters about things happening, there's some drama, there's some conflict, and Paul is trying to work through it. But, as you know, it's as if we've opened the Corinthians mail and we only see one side of the conversation. But that's sort of where we are today. Quick interesting note about Corinth. I don't know if you've been told this already, but the book of Acts makes reference to Paul's time in Corinth, and that he stood before a tribunal in Corinth while, I believe it's Gaius, who was a sort of local magistrate, a Roman magistrate, but that was there in Corinth while Paul was before the tribunal. And there is an inscription on a stone in Corinth that tells the specific year that Gaius was in Corinth. And so it's because of Paul's time in Corinth that any dates of the New Testament can be sort of corroborated and narrowed down to that specific year when we know Paul was in Corinth in, I believe it was 63, if my memory serves me. But because of that one inscription that says that Gaius was in Corinth in 63, all of the other dates about Paul's writings are sort of based off of that one reference point. So interesting note that Corinth is really significant for biblical studies, not only regarding Paul and Corinth, but dating everything in the New Testament. So Corinth is a pretty neat town and a neat thing to study when you're studying the Bible. But that's just an interesting aside for you. Let's dive into the text here. So we have quite a lot to read, but I think your normal pattern has been to read aloud. Is that right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Well, let's see here. Maybe we can go paragraph by paragraph. For chapter 10, let's maybe do 1 through 6, 7 through 11, and then 12 through the end of the chapter. How's that? Who would like to kick us off? Thank you.
I myself, Paul, appeal to you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold toward you when I am away. I ask that when I am present, I need not show boldness by daring to oppose those who think we are acting according to human standards. Indeed, we live as human beings, but we do not wage war according to human standards. For the weapons of our warfare are not merely human, but they have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every proud obstacle raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. We are ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete.
Look at what is before your eyes. If you are confident that you belong to Christ, remind yourself of this, that just as you belong to Christ, so also do we. Now, even if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem as though I'm trying to frighten you with my letters. For they say, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech contemptible. Let such people understand that what we say by letter when absent, we will also do when present.
We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves. But when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they do not show good sense. We, however, will not boast beyond limits, but will keep within the field that God has assigned to us, to reach out even as far as you. For when we're not overstepping our limits, when we reached you, we were the first to come all the way to you with the good news of Christ. We do not boast beyond our limits, that is, in the labors of others. But our hope is that, as your faith increases, our sphere of action among you may be greatly enlarged, so that we may proclaim the good news in the lands beyond you without boasting of work already done in someone else's sphere of action. Let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. For it is not those who commend themselves that are approved, but those whom the Lord commends.
I think we can just keep going if that's all right. And we'll want to treat this sort of as one unit. So let's go perhaps 1 through 6, and then 7 through 11, 12 through 15, and so on.
I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. Do bear with me. I feel a divine jealousy for you, for I promised you in marriage to one husband to present you as a chaste virgin in Christ. But I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one we proclaim, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or a different gospel from the one you accepted, you submit to it readily enough. I think that I'm not in the least inferior to these super apostles. I may be untrained in speech, but not in knowledge. Certainly in every way and in all things, we have made this evident to you.
Did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you might be exalted because I proclaim God's good news to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for my needs were supplied by the friends who came from Macedonia. So I refrained and will continue to refrain from burdening you in any way. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boast of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. And why? Because I do not love you? God knows I do.
And what I do, I will continue to do, in order to deny an opportunity to those who want an opportunity to be recognized as our equals in what they boast about. For such boasters are false prophets, apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is not strange if his ministers also disguise themselves as ministers of righteousness. Their end will match their deeds.
I repeat, let no one think that I am a fool. But if you do, then accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I am saying in regard to this boastful confidence, I am saying not with the Lord's authority, but as a fool. Since many boast according to human standards, I will also boast. For you gladly put up with fools, being wise yourselves. For you put up with it when someone makes slaves of you, or preys upon you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or gives you a slap in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. But whatever anyone dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I am talking like a madman. I am a better one with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless floggings, and often near death. 5 times I have received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I...
See this
Did I not copy this correctly?
Yeah, you're right.
3 times I was shipwrecked for a night, and a day.
Thank you, I did not crowd it correctly. 3 times I was shipwrecked for a night and a day. I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, dangers from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, and toil and hardship for many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. And besides other things, I am under daily pressure because of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak? I am not weak. And who is made to stumble? And I am not indignant. Sorry, Jared. Okay?
It's okay.
That's it. Okay.
Quite all right.
You want to keep going?
Let's keep going. We were gonna get all the way through chapter 12 and the first 10 verses of 13.
Okay, all right. I hope I can do that.
Well,
You just have to finish the next paragraph.
Really?
Somebody else will take up the
Nothing like
baton.
popping up. I'm sorry. Oh, dear. Okay. I thought, you know, I'm not singing today because I had a late night last night, so not that.
This is not a confession.
Okay, chapter, it is necessary to boast, nothing is to be gained by it, but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows was caught up into paradise and heard things are not to be told, that no portal is permitted to repeat. On behalf of such a one, I will boast, but on my own behalf, I will not boast except of my weaknesses. But if I wish to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard from me, even considering the exceptional character of the revelations. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. Wouldn't someone like to
Yeah,
come in?
that's
good.
Please?
I have been a fool,
For some
forced
reason, I like read a lot.
Yeah.
to it. Indeed, you should have been the ones commending me, for I am not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. The signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, signs and wonders and mighty works. How have you been worse off than the other churches, except that I myself did not burden you? Forgive me this wrong.
Here I am, ready to come to you this 3rd time, and I will not be a burden, because I do not want what is yours but you. For children ought not to lay up for their parents, but parents for their children. I will most gladly spend and be spent for you. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? Let it be as assumed that I do not burden you. Nevertheless, you say, since I was crafty, I took you in by deceit. Did I take advantage of you through any of those whom I sent to you? I urged Titus to go and sent the brother with him. Titus did not take advantage of you, did he? Did we not conduct ourselves with the same spirit? Did you not take the same steps?
Have you been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves before you? We are speaking in Christ before God. Everything we do, beloved, is for the sake of building you up. For I fear that when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish. I fear that there may perhaps be quarreling, jealousy, anger, selfishness, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. I fear that when I come again, my God may humble me before you, that I may have to mourn over many who previously sinned and have not repented of the impurity, sexual immorality, and litigiousness that they have practiced.
This is the third time I am coming to you. Any charge must be sustained by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. I warned those who sinned previously and all the others, and I warn them now while absent, as I did when present on my second visit, that if I come again, I will not be lenient, since you desire proof that Christ is speaking in me. He is not weak in dealing with you, but is powerful in you. For he was crucified in weakness, but lives by the power of God. For we are weak in him, but in dealing with you, we will live with him by the power of God. Examine yourselves to see whether you are living in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not realize that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test? I hope you will find out that we have not failed. But we pray to God that you may not do anything wrong, not that we may appear to have met the test, but that you may do what is right, though we may seem to have failed. For we cannot do anything against the truth, but only for the truth. For we rejoice when we are weak, and you are strong. This is what we pray for, that you may become perfect. So I write these things while I am away from you, so that when I come, I may not have to be severe in using the authority that the Lord has given me for building up and not for tearing down. Whew!
Really?
So let's begin. Let's sort of try to get a grasp of what's going on here. What did you hear? What is the topic, or a sort of one-sentence overview of what we just heard?
It sounds like there are offenses to men here.
Yes.
Still.
That's right.
What
That's
you
right.
said?
Yeah, what did he say?
He said it sounds like there are offenses to men here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. I think they're being human, just being human.
There's a lot of humanity going on in this passage, I think, and we'll get into that a little bit more.
Well, Paul calls them out on it.
Yeah.
He doesn't mince any words.
No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. Did you get a sense of who he seems to be calling out? What's your take on that?
It's on people.
Yeah, yeah.
I
But
didn't get it specific. It seemed like the community at large, but
It's
I may
pretty-
have missed it.
it's pretty vague, but he says at the beginning of chapter 11 that he's afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from that your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one we have proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit than what you received from us. So Paul, in a lot of what's going on here, is correcting the Corinthians for listening to someone who has attacked his apostolic authority. So that's why he opens with this emphasis on his meekness. So what Paul is doing here is, between his last visit and now, someone has come among the Corinthians, has sort of joined their church, if you will, and has been teaching and leading, assumedly, and has challenged Paul's authority to sort of be our apostle. So if the people in Corinth had sort of looked to Paul as their authority and sort of said, well, we're following Jesus, but Paul's our apostle. Paul's the one that brought the gospel here. He's the one that teaches us. He's the one we look to guide us. There are some who have come to Corinth and have challenged that to a degree. So what Paul is doing here is attacking those people and defending himself, saying he keeps referring to them as super apostles, or a couple times he does. And he's defending his own authority, and in there, as part of that argument, sort of defending his own authority as an apostle, he's sort of correcting the Corinthians as well and saying, don't just listen to any old person who shows up, because I'm the one that has the authority to speak to you.
And he's
not
pretty
these others.
emphatic about his ministry too. You'll notice nearly every paragraph has the word I in it.
Yeah, yeah. So let me ask you this. How do you, what's the tone here, or sort of how do you envision the person writing this? Because yeah, there's a lot of I language, and it's a passage that is unlike a lot of other scripture that we read, I think. How do you envision Paul, just by this passage alone, if you try to sort of forget everything else you know, but how do you hear this passage?
Egocentric.
Egocentric?
A little insecure.
A little insecure.
Name that tune.
It's good trumpet tune.
I almost feel like it sounds a little defensive to me.
Defensive, yeah. Yep.
I was thinking conceited, egocentric.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think he's
Seems
trying
like-
to establish his authority, but not his person so much. He talks like he's trying to humble himself at the same time he wants to increase his authority.
Yep.
Talks out of both sides of his mouth.
Okay.
Good point.
He seems like like what Jim was saying, that he was trying to defend what he had told the people, don't fall for every, Tom, Dick, and Harry that comes down the road. But he was also telling you how much trial and tribulation he'd been through, that much more than these other ones perhaps had, or whatever, that he had the true word, and they needed to stick with it. So
Yeah.
According to him, he's the poster boy of long suffering.
Really?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
I wouldn't want to be in his place.
So, you hearing just the different ways that we're reading this text in this room, we're picking up on a couple of different ways of coming at this. That if you go pick up half a dozen commentaries on this this passage, you will find the perspectives represented in this room. Some read this as Paul emphasizing his humility and saying, like, look, all I'm doing here is preaching Jesus. I'm not a good speaker. I come to you not in strength, but in weakness. And so some read this as sort of Paul trying to emphasize what he's been teaching all along. And then others read this, and some of us heard, well, there's really some conceit here. There's some defensiveness, and his sort of trying to establish his own, perhaps self-serving authority among these people. So you can sort of read this with some generosity toward Paul and his words here, or you can read it and hear some conceit and some of that humanity. And how you read that may influence what you hear from this text. But let's walk through it a little bit and sort of consider how those different readings might influence this. Okay?
I have a question.
Yes.
How did Paul become aware of these things?
Yeah. So in multiple places in the letters to the Corinthians, and this is not unusual, he makes reference to sending other people to them when he couldn't go. Between the sort of two letters of 2 Corinthians, there's reference to Titus and some brothers from Macedonia going to visit the Corinthians. So the assumption is that Paul is sending people like Titus to them to take letters, to bring encouragement and teaching, and then to report back to Paul. So there's probably some pretty long lapses between Paul's visits and Paul's letters, in which time different envoys are bringing him reports of what's going on. Yeah. So I'm going to sort of walk us through this in some chunks and sort of try to give us an outline and discuss a few things that may give us a little bit of insight into what's going on here. So the first chunk that we'll look at is just all of chapter 10. And this is really, again, we're going to try to treat these chapters as a letter by themselves, basically. And this is Paul's sort of opener, in which, in chapter 10, he's really emphasizing his meekness and gentleness, and that he's emphasizing that he's not coming to them with worldly strength and authority, but with a different sort of authority. So he says, indeed, we live as human beings, but we do not wage war according to human standards. For the weapons of our warfare are not merely human, but they have divine power to destroy strongholds. And so he, in this passage, he sort of is contrasting basically like worldly wisdom and strength and a different sort of wisdom and strength, a divine wisdom and strength. So one of the things that's key to understand in any New Testament text is that one of the core cultural values in this time period is honor and being publicly perceived as honorable. So this is sort of the subtext in some of Jesus's interactions with people, where they come and ask him a question, and sometimes we look at Jesus as sort of playing politics and dodging some questions people throw at him. But in that culture, Jesus was actually saying, you've come and challenged my honor by asking me this question. And when Jesus sort of turns it back on them, Jesus is sort of culturally maintaining his own honor while retorting and challenging their honor in response. So what Paul is doing here is saying, these people that have come among you who have sort of boasted about their own authority and attacked my authority, I'm not playing that game. I come to you with the meekness and gentleness of Christ. And Paul is sort of setting up where he's going to go in the rest of this passage by saying that these human standards of honor and authority are actually in competition with that meekness and gentleness of Christ. So I may not look as strong as these super apostles, but that's because I'm not playing by their rules.
So a question?
Yep.
This is the Roman times, correct?
Yes.
So we're talking about real authority versus, and that must have been pretty radical for a lot of people at that time.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm not certain that in this particular passage he's necessarily challenging that grand authority of Rome, but sort of saying our cultural, the ways that we culturally attribute authority to people are not the same way that we do as Christians. That the meekness and gentleness of Christ is a source of authority as much or maybe more than our normal cultural ways of seeing who is authoritative and who is powerful. In fact, weak people might seem powerful.
Right, Jared, don't you think that over the generations that we are just a messenger for the gospel? We're not authority over anything. We are just to proclaim Jesus Christ as the head of the church, as a God to your own life. And we build a community of that kind of people. And none of us have authority to know 100% about God. And we know each one of us knows some of them about God, and together we have some more idea. That's why we are here, and to listen to each other, to know, to learn the experience, the God forgiveness, God's power, all those things.
Yeah. And that's part of why Paul can't just say, well, clearly those other guys are wrong. He has to spend 3.5 chapters or so sort of building a case to explain why he thinks what they're saying is problematic or shouldn't be listened to as much as what Paul says.
Is there anything that indicates what it was they were saying that he's? I didn't see it in here.
We don't know a lot. We don't know a lot. So what we know about the opponents is what I'm going to call them. The opponents is just only what Paul tells us here. So clearly, we're not getting the most flattering portrayal of them or what they would say about themselves, but we really don't know much at all. We know that they share some of his own credentials because of that section where he says, you know, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they this and that? So am I. So they're probably Jewish from that passage. They probably share some of the training that he had and whatnot. We don't know the content of what their teachings were, except that, you know, sort of what's implied here, that whatever they're teaching, assumedly is different than what Paul was teaching to some degree. And part of their teaching is that Paul shouldn't be listened to at all, because he doesn't have the authority to speak that they do. That's sort of the implications that you can draw from this and other parts of the books, the letters to the Corinthians. But the short answer is no, we don't know a lot about them. So in this first section, I think I would summarize this as Paul sort of saying, both you and I belong to Christ, and I'm not going to attempt to commend myself beyond that. He's setting it up that the opponents are boastful, and I'm not going to be, because I'm appealing to a different authority. Then in the beginning of chapter 11, he sort of tips us off to what's going on a little bit. Those first few verses, he sort of says, I wish you'd bear with me a little bit longer and listen to me a little bit closer, because I'm really afraid that you're being misled by a different spirit and a different gospel. And then he addresses a specific challenge that has been brought up, and this is one that is mentioned in other portions of the books to the Corinthians. So we don't really know if this is something the Corinthians are upset about or if the opponents have brought this up. But Paul presents like a financial defense of his ministry here. Someone has claimed that Paul is ripping these people off, that he's showing up and he's only preaching the gospel if people are paying him to do it. And so he defends himself on this particular point here and says, look, if anything, I've robbed other churches, because these other churches were supporting me financially while I was ministering to you. And so he sort of defends himself against the charge of being a televangelist, maybe in our sort of language about it. He's like, no, I'm not one of these guys that preaches the gospel for a buck. I'm doing this for you. Then in 11:12 through 15, he has one of the most specific attacks on these super apostles, where he says in 11:13, for such boasters are false apostles, deceitful workers, and disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And so he's sort of starting to build this argument where he's subtly trying to tell the Corinthians that these guys are not even, they're certainly not super apostles that he sarcastically calls them, but they're not apostles at all. And so that's one of his most direct attacks. Then, beginning in 11:16, this is, maybe the most interesting part of this whole passage. This is where Paul starts to set up all of those I statements, all of this information about himself and how he is, Mike, how did you put it? That he's the picture of long suffering.
Poster boy.
The poster boy
of
long suffering. Yeah. So, and this, to me, I don't know how you heard it, but I can't read this except that it is very sarcastic.
Yeah.
Paul is saying, basically, he says, I don't boast about myself, but if I were to boast, here's what it would look like. And so he says, let no one think me a fool, but if you do, then accept me as a fool so that I too may boast a little bit. And then even when he's boasting, he says, I'm talking like a madman here. And so he's undermining these other people by saying, if they're going to boast, I'm going to boast, and look how idiotic it is to do this. So he sort of is still playing this sarcastic game so that his any self-aggrandizement that he's doing is still an attack on them doing the same thing. Paul is very careful with his words and is certainly not a fool, as he calls himself. In any of his writings that you read, that's pretty obvious, but here especially, I think. He's very careful about how he's going about challenging these people that have challenged him.
Then he goes through this complete litany of tribulations that he's been through.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yep.
Has he got little marks on the side of his wagon or something?
Right. So here again, this is him doing what he said at the beginning of chapter 10, right? He's boasting about his weakness here. He's boasting about all of the struggles he's had. Boasting about all the things that have made his ministry fail at times. When he was shipwrecked on his way somewhere. When he was beaten for the gospel that he preached. And so then he concludes that section in verse 29. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble and I am not indignant? So here he's sort of playing the game that he said he was going to play, but in this sort of sarcastic way that still undermines the other people. He's boasting in weakness, but he's also saying, if I'm weak, I'm the best weak. If weakness is the goal, I am the weakest.
In all his humility.
Yeah. So again here though, there are two ways of reading this, and I think I'm influencing you because you can tell sort of how I read this. That I think Paul is very witty and very sarcastic, and I think he knows what he's doing. But you can see that you can read this sort of as, well, he's kind of a jerk. And he's being sarcastic, and he's talking out of both sides of his mouth, I think we've said. And so Paul's kind of, we might be a little suspect of Paul being the authority for our church. But at the same time, there is an alternate way of reading this, where if you really do take into account the honor of the culture and the fact that his honor, his reputation has been challenged. for him not to engage in that honor challenge would be a source of shame and would ruin his reputation to a degree, excuse me.
Perceived as
culturally.
weakness.
It would be perceived as weakness and as his inability to demonstrate what honor really is. So on the one hand, we might say, you're being kind of conceited. But on the other hand, Paul might be saying, no, I care about this gospel and I care about your community so much that I'm going to engage in this honor challenge. And I'm going to offer a counterattack because I want you to know who really is the person you should be listening to. And Paul believes that he is communicating Christ to them in such an important way that he is going to go to all of these lengths to say, no, look, you really should be listening to me because I don't want you to be led astray. We'll keep going, but I think either way we want to read those things, there is some benefit for us. So let's sort of breeze through the rest of this. There's this really odd section at the beginning of chapter 12 where he says, you know, if it's necessary to boast, but I know a person who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. And we're kind of like, whoa, where did this come from? So this was a common rhetorical device in the ancient world that if you were to write about an especially self-aggrandizing thing like, I had a vision from God, you would switch to the third person. And you wouldn't come right out and say, God revealed God's self to me. But you would say, well, I know a guy who had a vision.
Asking for a friend, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're familiar with this in different settings, but almost certainly this is Paul referring to a vision that he had. Maybe the Damascus Road vision, we're not certain, but almost certainly this is Paul sort of displaying this high level of God revealing God's self to him in a vision, and right after that story, him still saying, but I'm not being boastful because God gave me this thorn in my flesh so that I can't boast, so that I'm constantly humbled in a way. So that's sort of chapter 12, him giving these sort of contrasting perspectives of himself. And then let's skip ahead just to these first 10 verses of chapter 13, where Paul sort of concludes his argument and says, he exhorts them to examine themselves and to test themselves to ensure sort of their faithfulness to Christ. And I think this is really interesting that he says that this is what he prays for their sort of perfection of their faith. They're continuing to work out their salvation, as the scriptures say in other places, and that's his measure of his success. Even if he appears to have failed, his ultimate goal is that those people that he is sort of mentored in the faith, that they stick with it and continue the journey of faith that some 2,000 years ago we're still doing ourselves. So this section is this really odd section where we have a very unusual glimpse into Paul as the leader of a congregation. Even though he's sort of this itinerant minister that's often absent, but he's writing to this community. And I think it's really, really interesting that, obviously, some of us probably have this gut reaction, because many of us were raised in this faith, to sort of defend Paul and to say, well, not, he's being countercultural, he's emphasizing weakness, and all of these things. But I think even if we say, well, he also was being pretty conceited, and this isn't the way that I would have communicated these things, there still is a point to be made here that Paul is willing to go to whatever lengths he needs to go to. Because if we listen to this final passage, he's saying, really, your perception of me is not the end game here. The end game is that I want you to hear theology that will help you, that will carry you through your journey of faith better. This is sort of the journey that we've gone on as a church as well, right? That, I've only been here for 6 years, but many of you have been here longer, and you know that the church, Wilshire Baptist and the Big C church all over the world, we're constantly trying to figure out, who do we listen to here? Who is the authority on this question, whatever the question may be of the time? And how do we continue this journey of faith faithfully? And this is a really interesting insight to how tumultuous that can be for a church leader, and how important it was for Paul that the people get this, not get this right, I don't think, but that they move forward with the best chance of a faithful outcome. He wants them to be unified and to continue to listen to the Spirit in a way that is going to be beneficial for the community. So I think what I want to leave you with here this week is that as we individually and communally are trying to figure out what it means to be faithful and how to move forward in uncharted territory. We often think that, we're in 2019, we're in uncharted territory in a lot of ways. This is the same thing people of our faith have been doing since the beginning of the faith. Paul was in uncharted territory. There had never been a community of Jesus followers in Corinth before. And this struggle of trying to figure this out is part of our ancient tradition of being Christians. And it's something that, just like Paul and these people were trying to figure out, we are also trying to figure out in communication with our community, with the voices of people like Paul that are authoritative and influential for us, and with our scriptures. So I think my sort of take home from this to you today is, Robert, like you said, we don't have this figured out. We've never had everything figured out, and that this is all part of our faithful journey together. So go in peace that we're all on this journey together.
Thank you, Jerry. Very much. Okay, let's do our prayer requests. We have a request here for traveling safety for my parents this week as they drive to Dallas. This is for Diana, so they're coming. Okay. Safe travel for them. And Vicki prays for safe travels while she was in Europe for 3 weeks, and she just left, but we're glad she's back. Continued healing for Sandy Mitchell. That was nice of someone to write. That was for my sister who broke her pelvis, it turns out, and then just had surgeries in rehab now. And for Joyce Adams, experiencing excruciating pain from the shoulder surgery, MRI yesterday. So we'll continue to pray for Joyce on that. Anything else to add on this?
Oh, praise, we got through our accreditation, I forgot to put that on.
Okay.
We got through our visit. Our